Hi, I'm Clansi Rogers, Vice-President of Sydney Adventist Forum. This is Future Faith. In this episode, I speak with my mentor and former lecturer, Dr. Ray Roennfeldt. Ray has been a pastor, missionary, lecturer, and theologian, and he's got questions about the way our theology impacts our mission and ministry. How do we keep our fundamental beliefs Christ-centered? And what does it mean to be open to the Spirit's leading? We began our conversation exploring the process of and the historical reasons for formalizing theology and the impact this boundary setting can have on our faith community, being exclusive or inclusive.
The main leaders of the church, like Joseph Bates, James White, Ellen White, Loughborough, and so forth, they had all come out of churches that had basically pitched them out of their communions. And so they were extremely concerned that this new faith community that they were setting up would not be a creedal one, because they'd been judged by creeds and they were not going to put in place a creed. In fact, it divided some of them, and you can see some early breakaways from this Second Advent movement over that sort of issue, and even over church organisation. So it was certainly not an easy process. And of course, not all of them agreed. Like the majority of them in the early years actually didn't believe that Jesus was truly divine or equal with the Father. So their communion was based around something other than just a uniformity of thought. So not an easy process, and it was really not until, it seems to me, as I look at the history of the Adventist Church, that it was not until about the 1830s that they actually came up with a set of fundamental beliefs. And at that stage, there were 22 fundamental beliefs. And when I was baptised as a teenager into the Adventist Church, I was baptised into a church that had 22 fundamental beliefs. And I often tell people that my pass rate is actually lower than some people's pass rate, because I only have to, just joking, I only have to agree to something like about 11 and I've passed, whereas nowadays it's 14 you've got to agree to.
That's right. That's 90 years or something. That's a long time.
It certainly is. When the fundamentals were first put in place, the idea was that these would express what we believe to other people.
So explainers, not definers.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So they were descriptors, or another way of putting it is they were descriptors rather than prescriptors. So there was some inclusivity built into those beliefs. And this is just my feeling, but I feel that over the last few years, there's been more of an idea of, well, if you don't agree to every point of these fundamentals, then there are other churches for you. And to me, that's a pretty sad sort of situation.
Yeah, it's also quite ironic that's considering that those early Adventists, that's what had happened to them. If you're thinking like this, go somewhere else.
Yeah.
Or maybe it's in our DNA then. I've been thinking about how Adventism as a movement, as a collection of people, really came about because they were wanting to answer the questions posed by the Great Disappointment. Find out where they'd been wrong, or find an understanding. And how the unique way that our pioneers answered some of those questions became essentially our defining features. Are those central questions still the same ones? Are they still useful questions? How do we keep our theology focused on Jesus and not on our own identity as a denomination?
Yeah. I say to myself, I don't see how those questions can be the same ones. I think they were, as you say, they were really important questions for our pioneers. But we've gone on for 175, 176 years since then. And the questions that people are asking are quite different questions to what, or the problems that people are dealing with now are quite different problems to back then. So that's a really important part of our history. But we do have to ask ourselves, what are the questions that people are asking around us? One of my theologian friends said some years ago that problem is that people today are not asking the questions that we've got answers for. So we're going to have to wait until they ask the questions that we've got answers for again. And I just say to myself, sorry, too late for that. One of the things that we need to do, and just over the last few days, I've been looking at our 28 fundamentals, and I've been asking myself, is Jesus actually central to this fundamental? That's an interesting thing for us to do. Just scroll through the fundamentals and ask, is Jesus' death, burial, resurrection, and coming central to that fundamental? Like even our fundamental on the Trinity, is Jesus in fact central to that? Because to be really frank, I don't think we would ever have come up with any idea of Trinity. And none of us, I think, fully understand what that means, but we've been on a journey on that one. And I don't think any of us would have come up with that unless Jesus had intersected with human history. So we do have to ask ourselves that. And then I think as well, we need to ask ourselves, are we just communicating with ourselves in our fundamentals? Or is our focus outward, like our early pioneers' focus was? They were saying, we need to explain to other people what we're saying and why we're saying certain things. So our focus needs to be outwards, in other words, missional. Mm. So those are a couple, and then of course Scripture, it seems to me, Paul says that Scripture is there to make us wise to salvation. And to introduce us to Jesus Christ. So if that's the case, then everything that we have to say has to be centered in him.
People often think of theologians as theoreticians, not practitioners. Do you think that's a fair description?
I think it's often fair, but I don't think it should be the case, because when I look at Scripture itself, Clancy, I see that the biblical writers have their feet very firmly on the ground. Mm. Like, for instance, Paul in Philippians chapter 2, which is probably the key New Testament text that talks about the nature of Jesus Christ. Sure, you're finding all this stuff in especially the Gospel of John, but Paul states it pretty clearly who Jesus is and where he was and how he humbled himself and came into this world. Mm-hmm. And his background statement is, let this mind be in you as it was in Jesus Christ. So when he's talking Christology, to use the theological term, when he's talking nature of Christ, he's actually talking about the practical connection between that idea and the way that we actually live.
You know, we were talking about earlier about how our theology defines us and how our formalized beliefs were there to explain who we were to other people. What about what people like to call the distinctives or the 7 S's? How do they intersect idea and action?
Yeah. I can think of many ways in which they do, and maybe we need to think about those. When I talk about the 7 S's, and I don't know whether off the top of my mind I could actually name them all, but there's like salvation, Sabbath, Scripture,
State of the Dead,
Sanctuary,
Second Coming.
Yeah, Second Coming.
Spiritual gifts.
Yeah, all of those.
Ray, you made me memorize those in your theology lectures. You should be able to reel them off.
I should be able to reel them off easily. But Take, for instance, the Sabbath. The Sabbath is something that's not just an idea. Now, when you look at the way that Jesus, in fact, kept Sabbath, there was a very strong service component of the way that he kept Sabbath. In fact, he heals people on the Sabbath, and it's not emergency healing that he's doing. He's caring for people who have chronic conditions. And so that's telling us something about the Sabbath there. And the Sabbath is not just a doctrine, it's an experience. And I think of a few years ago when Carmel invited some people who were not even Christians to our home for Sabbath lunch. And I sort of, almost to my horror, I hear her on the phone saying, we'd love you to come over for lunch on Saturday. Saturday is our Sabbath. And I'm going, man, these people are going to say, what in the world? And it was interesting that some days later, the two families came on separate occasions, but some days later, the wife rang Carmel and said, thank you so much for inviting us. It freaked us out when you said this was your Sabbath, because we thought, what are they going to be doing? Are they going to be praying and singing? But she said, you know what? We could do with a Sabbath in our lives. And I said to myself, man, the Sabbath is not just a doctrine. The Sabbath is an experience. Unless we're actually getting hold of that, then we've actually not gotten hold of the Sabbath.
It's always interested me. The most interesting thing I think about our formalized fundamentals, particularly the versions post the 1980s, is that they have this preamble about how we believe in present truth, and that our statement of beliefs is open to periodic review, ongoing review. And as you said earlier, in the last 15 years, we've added one, we've edited a couple of them. Do you think we will ever make significant additions or even subtractions in the way that we express our beliefs? Is there room for real change rather than minor tweaking?
Before you were talking about theory and practice, and having been to a couple of general conference sessions, I have to say it would be a really difficult task. But that we actually say that to ourselves. So we should be actually honest to what we're saying, because we're saying the Bible is our only creed. We say that. This is not a creed. This is what we believe. And we can modify this, we can edit it, we can add, we can subtract. And I guess to some degree, it involves what we mean by accepting truth as a church. Does it mean that we can at times say we need to actually delete that? That's in fact our Protestant heritage. And that's important for us to keep in mind, that our Protestant pioneers, back to Lutherans, Zwingli and the Anabaptists, and then through to Wesley and so forth, who had quite an impact on Adventism, they were basically saying, go back to the Bible, examine everything by Scripture. So that, to me, that's a really important dimension, that as a church, if we're going to continue to grow missionally, then in fact we need to take that on board. But how to do it is another issue. One thing that it strikes me, that in this present COVID climate, people are actually meeting in smaller groups, and they're saying, we're spending an hour and a half or 2 hours on the Sabbath school lesson or on some other topic reading scripture together. And I can't help but think that in the end, that in itself is going to impact on the church. I hope it will, because that's where we came from as a church, as a movement. So maybe it's time to go back to the future.
Well, if there's not, if the process of altering significantly or changing or deciding that some things aren't quite as fundamental as others, if that process is so difficult and is so complex, how do you see Adventism? Are we a broad church with room for variation, or does having such a now extensive set of beliefs, 28 up from the 22 that you grew up with, does that make us have difficulty? Does that make inclusivity a difficult thing?
Clancy, I think it does to some extent. Now, when I was first appointed to come to Avondale, I was in Papua New Guinea, and I had to call up Arthur Perch and give an account of what I believed about fundamental beliefs. And so I drove to town, very rough roads, get there, and I said to him, okay, where do you want to start? Do you want to start with number 1? And he said, no, I don't want to do that. He said, I want to know whether you're comfortable playing in the Adventist ballpark. And I've always thought that was a very wise thing, because I think sometimes we can use the fundamentals and interpret the fundamentals in such a way that it narrows things very greatly. And I think the Adventist ballpark metaphor is a great one, because it's actually saying some people will actually be out on the right wing and some people on the left wing, and yet we can still be together playing the same game.
Perhaps we need a rethink of who we are, and rather than people united by a series of answers, we could think of ourselves as the early pioneers did, people united around a series of questions. Yeah,
I think that's actually a pretty good way of putting it.
Yeah, I have to admit I stole that from my husband, but I think it's a good. I think it's a good one.
Yeah, it is good. Yeah, I like that.
Well, Ray, thank you for chatting with me. It's been an interesting conversation, and we appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. Good to talk to you.